There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Montreal is Khalid Mustafa Medani. He heads the African Studies Program and Graduate Program at McGill University's Institute of Islamic Studies. Nada Mustafa Ali is a faculty fellow and lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She focuses on women's gender issues and human rights in various parts of the world, including Sudan and South Sudan. Aly Verjee has lived and worked in Sudan. He's currently a researcher specializing in Eastern Africa and a visiting expert at the United States Institute of Peace right here in Washington, D.C. And joining us via Skype from Khartoum is Sudanese social worker and activist Fadia Khalaf. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Fadia, let me start with you. Dramatic developments in Sudan. al-Bashir has been overthrown, and events are moving very quickly. We're hearing that former members of the government are being arrested. What's the latest there in Khartoum right now?
Well, the latest news that the people are still protesting in the military headquarters because they believe that Omar al-Bashir was not grounded yet.
So what is going to happen? Do you know that if he's going to be referred to the International Court?
Well, I doubt this. I don't think it's going to happen as long as these members of the same regime are still in power and still protecting him. So the game is not over.
The new head of the military council has lifted the curfew and released protesters. Could you give us some idea of the protests that are taking place on the streets right now? All
right. Sudanese or the protesters decided not to leave the military headquarters until their demands get achieved. Well, we do not want just the curfew, cancellation of the curfew, or releasing all the arrested people. And by the way, they did not really release all the arrested people. There's a lot of citizens from Darfur are not released yet.
Okay, let me bring in Khalid Medani. He's in Montreal. Khalid, the military leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has addressed the country. He addressed the country over the weekend. Let's listen to what he had to say.
A military council will be established to represent the sovereign state. A civilian government will be formed and agreed upon between all sides, and the transitional military council will be committed to establishing a civilian government based on the following: a transitional period lasting for a maximum of 2 years, in which during or at the end of it, governance of the country will be handed over to the civilian government formed by the people.
So, Khalid, as we just heard from Khartoum, people are still on the streets, they're protesting. They want immediate civilian rule. We just heard the head of the military government there talking about a 2-year transition. It seems that both sides want different things. How will this be resolved? Is there a compromise somewhere?
Well, I think that the compromise, really the important aspect, the compromise cannot be achieved if the central demand of the opposition and those protesting now for 4 months is not met. And that is very straightforward. They were very clear, the opposition is very clear, that their really central demand is not only the removal of Bashir or faces, so to speak, associated with the former regime, but the institutions of the regime itself. And in order to do that, there must be a swift transition to a civilian government. Now, the opposition that is organized around the Declaration of Freedom of Change, that includes the Sudanese Professional Association, as well as the majority of political parties in opposition, have already stated that they are more than willing to have some representatives of independent military officers within this transitional civilian government. They take very seriously the national role of the army, and they also take very seriously and understand very well, of course, that it's very important for the sake of stability going forward that there would be a very, very important but limited role for the Sudanese armed forces. However, they've been very clear from the very beginning that they are not going to accept a military government for 2 years. They're very clear that they are very much committed to a transition to a civilian government, primarily to make sure that technocrats really head an independent Sudanese, and those that really have been at the very heart of these protests take over power. And that is extremely important. It's a very clear demand. And I don't think that there could be a real compromise between the military council and those in the streets at the moment if these central demands are not met. And this is why you see the continuation of Sudanese protesting in Khartoum and throughout the country.
Ali, what do you make of that? Seems like a recipe for confrontation there.
I think the protesters have been emboldened by their success in getting rid of President Bashir, of getting rid of the first chair of the military council, but that's not enough. As both our previous guests have said, they want to see more. There needs to be more action. There have been some steps in the last few days that are encouraging, the lifting of censorship being one, the release of some prisoners being another, but there's a lot more to be done. And really, the army needs to be judged by its actions and not only its words.
Ali, what we see happening in Sudan clearly marks a fallout between Omar Bashir and the military leadership in the country. What precipitated that?
Well, Bashir himself is a military man, let's be clear about that. And so if you're in the Sudanese military today of a senior rank, you have been ideologically vetted, you have been vetted for your loyalty as well. But clearly there was a point where some people in the high command felt that this situation could not go on indefinitely, that the economic crisis in which the country was embroiled, that the political crisis in which the country was embroiled needed some resolution, and some of them clearly have decided to act against Bashir. But this by itself isn't necessarily going to satisfy what the protesters are after.
There have been protests in Sudan before. We had them in 2011, 2012 as well. What's happening now? Does that surprise you?
There's a long history of protest in Sudan over the course of this regime, over the course of previous governments as well. What's different now has been the ability to mobilize and sustain the protests and to organize in a way that we did not see in 2013, which were the last big protests in Sudan. I'm not surprised that this regime has run out of ideological ideas and energy, and so it's not by any means surprising to many Sudanese that they didn't have the solutions to the problems that the country faces. So those protests, I think people are still getting used to the fact that there is now a new leadership in charge, or the potential of a new leadership in charge. But clearly, if it's just the same sort of military, very exclusive, very limited type of government without much reform, then that's not going to be enough.
All right, let's go to Boston, bring in Nada. Nada, the protests, as we heard, are continuing in Khartoum. Let's listen to what some of the protesters have been saying. Let's watch this.
Yes, we support General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, but we still have demands. We have a better vision.
The first is to give power to the citizens, to hold the criminals accountable, to hand Bashir over to the international court, or to bring him to justice here in the country.
We want actions. We don't want statements. We want pictures of those who violated our lives for all those years inside prison.
The people should not stop until all demands are met. Regardless of the consequences, if they fail, nothing will happen.
So, Nada, what is your view of what is happening in Sudan there? If you listen to those protesters, they clearly want the president to face justice at the international court.
Well, let me start by saluting the courage of the Sudanese women and men who have resisted the regime of Omar al-Bashir for 30 years. In fact, resistance to Islamism has started before the overthrow of the democratically elected government by the National Islamic Front, later National Congress Party regime. And I think that the demands that these protesters are expressing, are asking for, are legitimate, and there should be a mechanism for access to justice for people who had been affected by the various policies of the regime, the atrocities that the regime carried out in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, in the Blue Nile, earlier in South Sudan, and also in Khartoum against political opposition. And so at present, it's not clear whether President Bashir would be handed over to the International Criminal Court. He is wanted for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Darfur, as well as 3 counts of genocide. But there should be, an arrangement for some sort of justice in Sudan if we are to ensure peace, long-lasting peace, and if we are to really make sure that this does not happen again. I mean, the atrocities that occurred under the regime of Omar al-Bashir do not happen again in Sudan.
Fadia, leaders of the protest movement in Sudan are calling for civilian rule. In fact, in their words, they want immediate and unconditional civilian rule. Khalid talked to us earlier about some kind of hybrid leadership which would have civilians in it, but also some of the military leaders. Is that going to be acceptable to the protesters in Sudan?
Well, according to what I hear, inside the protest, some people say yes, they're okay with that, or it could be fine with them, and some others say no, they just want a complete civilian government.
All right, Khalid, as I said earlier on, there have been protests in Sudan different before, but what's different this time, and what started these protests in the first place?
Well, what started the protest, as many, of course, of your listeners may know, is the kind of economic crisis. And in particular, the catalyst was the implementation of economic reforms and austerity that led to the tripling in the price of bread and fuel. And in the northern town of al-Burhan, you began to see a great deal of protest that encapsulated first the northern region, then went, and of course, went into the capital city, Khartoum, and also to the western part of the country, Darfur. So the economic crisis, of course, was a catalyst. But as your other guest also mentioned, there have been the kind of sporadic and very important protests, at least since 2011. And those protests really have increased over the years. And also, in addition to that, there has been an emergence of a very, very important coordinating body, the Sudanese Professional Association. That has really has been key in the expansion of the protest, the coordination of the protest, and the sustainability of the protest. And of course, the role of women is something that is remarkable and very, very important. So this is a combination of many, not only years, but decades of opposition to the Islamist regime. So what makes them different, I believe, is the fact that they absolutely encompass the entire country. They also really bridge the rural and urban divide in the country. And they now encompass all Sudanese across ethnic groups, across religions. You have Christian Sudanese involved, Muslim Sudanese involved. This is really a revolution of an extraordinary kind of depth and breadth. And this is why, as the Sudanese activists have been saying increasingly, and even more so today, that the real power and the real pressure is coming from the street. It is their revolution, and what they want to ensure, of course, at this point, that it's not co-opted as these revolutions have been in the past, by a military regime that switches faces, but where the institutions of the regime, and in particular the National Congress Party, the Islamist regime, remain. We have issues to deal with the economy. These are economic institutions that have for decades been monopolized by the Islamist regime and the ruling party. We have now a paramilitary kind of militia, the rapid support forces that are, remarkably incorporated into the Transition Military Council. And Sudanese protesters have been very clear that they want, of course, not the dismantling overnight of the institutions of the regime, but they want to have, good faith steps. They want to make sure that the steps are in place in order to deal with this very, very important and very deep state, so to speak.
No, I'd like to get your view on this. As Khalid just told us, that these protests involve everybody. Everybody's involved in it. A lot of people are calling for change. It transcends differences in Sudan. Now, in the past, you've expressed concerns for what you termed Sudan's marginalized communities. Who are these communities, and what are your concerns?
Well, there are various marginalized communities in all parts of Sudan, not only in the geographic margins of Sudan. But this term is oftentimes used to refer to people who had been excluded from the benefits of citizenship since Sudan achieved its political independence. Those are people who are in the Nuba Mountains or South Kordofan and the southern Blue Nile. There is a war that had been ongoing there since 2011. People had been forced out of their homes. Therefore, of course, the international media has really highlighted some of the atrocities that happened there, but the war had been ongoing since 2003, 2004, and violence is still ongoing. So these areas are really militarized, and some of these groups are, or at the beginning of the protests, actually, the leaders of the organized members of these groups have actually expressed support of the protests that had taken place in Khartoum, that started in December 2018, and had said that some of their constituencies are actually actively involved in the protests themselves. And Dr. Khalid Medani referred earlier to the Declaration of Freedom and Change, which the Forces of Freedom and Change signed. It's a coalition, as he said, of the Sudanese Professionals Association,
right.
Various opposition groups, as well as women's organizations and youth movements. And it consists of 3 tenets. And the second tenet actually focuses on handing over power to a transitional civilian government. And
right.
this government should implement 9 points. And the very first point on this list is ending the war and addressing its root causes, or starting to address its root causes.
Okay.
So the removal of the regime of Bashir, I think, is a good news for people in marginalized parts of Sudan. But this is also the start for really bringing about transformation in Sudan, including for women and for persons with disabilities and other groups marginalized in other distinct ways that have been taking place in the protests as well.
Okay, Ali, of course, Omar Bashir was the face of Sudan, but there are others in that regime who've been removed. The Sudanese State News Agency announced over the weekend the resignation of the intelligence chief, a man known as Salah Abdallah Ghosh, very feared man in Sudan. Who is Ghosh, and how significant is the fact that he's been forced to resign?
A very powerful man indeed, and somebody who commands a very powerful agency. Ghosh himself has been a political survivor. He has been director of the intelligence service before. He was removed. He's returned in that position, now removed again. What we really need to ask is whether his dismissal is actually evidence of his being sidelined, or whether he will continue to play a role from the shadows. And this is a question we need to ask about some of the other people that have been removed as well. This comes really to Khalid's point about the deep state. Sudan is a country where the intelligence service owns businesses. It owns restaurants. It owns many, many ordinary enterprises that people deal with. The army, the same thing, owns businesses, also outside of the defense sector. There are restaurants and banks and other commercial activities that are commanded by the military. So removing an individual, no matter how powerful he might be, is certainly important. And he was somebody who was very key, has very good links with the Gulf countries as well. But it isn't by itself evidence that the intelligence service, nor for that matter the army, are permanently sidelined, are permanently out of the picture. They command a great deal of economic power as well as political and military power.
Now, protest leaders and the military, they did meet over the weekend, Fadia. What came off that meeting? What did they discuss?
Well, they've been discussing about the transitional period and that it should be a transitional civilian government, in matter of fact. But they're still negotiating. They did not have their statement yet, as far as I know.
Now, as you pointed out, you yourself took part in these protests. What would you like to see happen in Sudan?
Well, first of all, to surrender all the members who were involved in killing the Sudanese people for the past 30 years, not only for the past 4 months as the statement of al-Burhan, as it was mentioned. And we just want to build a new Sudan. This is what I really want to see to happen. And we, of course, we want to have a civilian government. We don't want any military ruling or any ruling by the name of religion, in matter of fact, especially the Islamic regime, I mean, because Sudan is not only about Muslims. We have a lot of Christian, we have non-religious people, we have a diverse community. Yeah. So we want a fair ruling.
Khalid Medani, as you pointed out, there's a whole range of groups involved in these protests, a number of them professional groups, as you told us. Do you have confidence that the current protest leadership will be able to steer the country to stability and form a civilian government?
Well, I'm extremely confident of that, and I'm glad you asked that question because, of course, most international actors and those observing Sudan are, concerned that this would lead to instability, and most importantly, the discourse that has been promoted by Bashir and now even this military council, to be quite frank, is that there are no real kind of strong institutions, that civil society is not strong enough, that they don't know who to speak to, as if the Sudanese Professional Association has not coordinated all of these protests since the very beginning, that perhaps the political parties are weak. But the Declaration of Freedom of Change is a remarkable coalition, not only of professionals and labor unions, but as I said before, political parties. And of course, Sudan has a long history of actually pursuing democratic experiments that have failed, but nevertheless there's a deep democratic political culture. I want to highlight that just today the Sudanese Professional Association said that while they will of course participate in interim civilian government, they made it very clear that they have no political ambitions going forward, that they will be vigilant in terms of consolidating and democracy in Sudan, but they don't have any political ambitions in terms of even upcoming elections. And the point here, to be very, very clear, is that having learned from the past, the Sudanese opposition simply is very, very clear about a swift democratic transition that, as I said before, that is composed of technocrats and people that are independent from politics for these 4 years, because right now the military council basically monopolizes the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And so, I'm going to echo, frankly, the statement of the Troika, the US, the UK, Norway, who have recently called, as you know, the swift, I want to emphasize, swift transition to civilian government.
Ali, the changes that we see in Sudan, the big change, of course, the removal of Omar Bashir, how will this affect the region? Did Sudan have any major backers in the region?
Bashir's removal is obviously symbolically important, and it does complicate for some time Sudan's relations with its foreign partners, partly because these relations are so individual. So certainly when you talk about the Sudanese relationship with Egypt and President al-Sisi there, or the Sudanese relationship with the Gulf countries, these are very much individual relations. But that being said, the long-term interests of all of these countries remain, and their concern for what happens in Sudan will remain. What could really be a problem now is seeing this transformation within Sudan being co-opted, or an attempt to co-opt it by outside countries. That would not be helpful, and that's really the risk that is faced by Sudan and Sudanese, rather than any great risk being faced by the neighboring countries.
What about relations with South Sudan, which of course used to be a part of Sudan?
Yes. Well, again, there are long-term national interests on both sides of the border here, and those transcend personalities. I don't think the narrative that because there is change in Sudan, there is therefore instability everywhere else, including in South Sudan, is very accurate or very fair. The reality is that the South Sudanese are in great difficulty of implementing their own peace deal for their own reasons. And it's true that without Bashir, there isn't anybody to knock their heads together from the Sudanese side, but that doesn't mean that Sudan's interests in South Sudan disappear. I'm sure Sudan will continue to play a very important role and monitor very carefully what's going on in South Sudan over the months and years to come.
Fadia, one final question, and that is, the momentum is with the protesters right now, and you are part of that protest movement, you've experienced it. Can the protest movement sustain that momentum?
Well, I think they are unstoppable. I mean, they carried out a very huge movement since December, and with different techniques, smart ones, and it was peaceful. I mean, all the civilians who participated in this protest, they were unarmed. They were facing danger. They were facing death. They were facing the gunfire by the militias. But here they are. They have achieved some stuff. I guess what happened so far is a partial success, and we're looking for more. So I believe in them. I'm quite confident about this.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.